Well, we've been approaching in rather scatter fashion a set of ideas that we might now begin to try to bring together. I've been trying to suggest to you that there's been a spirit of bohemianism very deeply rooted in the American mentality from the beginning. This is of particular importance to us because it's necessary background to the establishment of actual enclaves of bohemias in 20th century society in most of the major cities of the country. And it was in these enclaves that bohemianism, late in the 20s, met with, and in many ways joined with, merged with, revolutionary politics, leading to the literature of the 30s that we are talking about. Before we undertake to lay out the rather complicated dynamics by which all of this happened, let us remind ourselves of several things. First, a prediction. I may or may not be right, but I hope that one of the end products of our investigation will be to demonstrate to you, you in particular, that you're not as new as you think. That is to say, today in particular, the stance of many young people is that they turn their backs on all of tradition, and that the attitudes and styles they are developing have no precedent. I think I'm going to be able to show you that many of your lifestyles have a rather hoary tradition, spelled H-O-A-R-Y. That what is happening now has happened before, perhaps quantitatively and even qualitatively. There are distinctions to be made about current day developments as against similar events, cultural events that preceded them, but that essentially the basic spirit of the basic enterprise of rebelliousness, of casting off shackles, of denying the ancestral, of being indifferent to tradition, of insisting that you are doing something specifically yours that is not dictated by a pattern from other parts of society or from the past. All of this is by way of a romanticism. That rebelliousness is built into the human spirit, and most particularly into the American spirit, and that in being, in the most extreme sense, a rebel, those of you who are, you are being a very good American, whether you want to be or not. We have along the way referred vaguely and perhaps a bit facetiously to romanticism, the romantic view of the human condition and of nature. I want now to suggest that this has a direct bearing on our emerging definition of bohemianism. In the more naive and more primitive sense, we are told that the romantic attitude is one of vast discontent with things as they are, with reality as conveyed to us by our senses, and therefore involves a search for some kind of transcendence, of rising above and going beyond, of breaking out of the sensory trap, of finding new mysteries and delights which are not encountered in ordinary society, by ordinary people in ordinary society. And so the romantic, poetry and painting or whatever, undertakes to explore those shadowy areas that normal, rational people say either do not exist or are not worth exploration. The unconscious, the arcane, the mysterious, the especially glamorous, the shadowy, the areas of wild vitality, of runaway energy. The hope always being, the yearning indeed, in some undefined manner, to find a larger, more encompassing, freer life, as well as a richer vision of the world. This is more often than not the emphasis that we derive from definitions given to us of romanticism. But here now we have a most valuable checkpoint in the two books by Hoxie, Neal, Fairchild, which again I urge you to read as fundamental books in our investigation. You'll find, if you have a complicated attitude toward romanticism, you'll find sheer delight in this guy as well as vast knowledge, because he does something that very few scholars do. He has made himself a lifetime authority on romanticism, specifically the romantic poetry of the 19th century, but larger areas than that. He perhaps has known as much about this subject as anybody who's worked in it. And the point is that if you read, for example, the collection of lectures, The Romantic Quest, you will find a man who apparently is absolutely dedicated to his subject, because his delivery is so deadpan. And yet if you unravel his texts, you find that he despises romanticism. It's a vast intellectual game. He is an authority on that which he abominates, but he doesn't say it in so many words. Aside from the quality of the prose, which is most impressive indeed, there is a complication of thought which will help to correct the simplistic definitions of romanticism that we're often given. Fairchild develops his idea of romanticism with a set of apparently polar opposite terms. Transcendentalism, which we're always told about, also descendentalism. What he's saying is that the basic romantic position is that the intuitive, the emotional, the instinctive are all superior areas of experience than the cerebral and the sensory. If you have that romantic position, you feel that your energy urges are more significant in your total behavior picture than your ideas and the putting of ideas to work, then you are discontented. And maybe that defines the basic quality of the life of every man in every society, to one extent or another, allowing for great variations between societies. But if you have that discontent, how do you proceed to act upon it? Certainly, you are transcendental in the sense that you want to get out of this trap and move upward and onward and outward. But you're also descendental, and you're never one without the other. Descendental in this context meaning that you indeed are urged to plunge into the sensory life as fully as possible, hoping there to discover new mysteries, new vitalities, which in turn will feed the other non-cerebral side of you. So you find that the typical behavior of a romantic poet is to curse at the world as he sees it, a Byron, Shelley, or whatever, but then to plunge into the wildest experiences. Now, it seems to be contradictory, but only if you are a Hegelian-Marxist, namely a dialectic thinker, can you see that the one would never exist without the other, the one will always color the other. There is some infernal urge to escape, which is transcendental. The urge often leads you into a plunge downward, into an immersion in the roughest and most violent kind of experience, by way of seeing if there is any possible escape valve there. He goes on to say, Fairchild does, the savage, the peasant, and the child do something to justify a Unitarian conception of romantic naturalism. The Romanticists aspired to something higher, in quotes, than analytical reason, and yet they were greatly interested in beings who have not yet attained even the merely analytical stage. In the light of what has been said about the fusion of descendentalism and transcendentalism, this fact is not difficult to understand. The naive and primitive souls admired by the Romanticists are above logic precisely because they are below it. In being close to nature, they are close to the supernatural and partake of that sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, that's a quote, which can never be attained through that false secondary power by which we multiply distinctions. In fact, this mingling of the sub-rational with the supposedly super-rational is a cardinal trait of Romanticism. Whether there is such a thing as the super-rational, and whether any conscious attempt to rise above logic is not inevitably to fall below it, no matter how gracefully the collapse is sublimated by mystical terminology, are questions to be asked, but hardly to be answered. In any case, the Romanticists believed in the super-rational, and in their efforts to describe it to mankind, often drew their examples from the sub-rational. And now he goes into a detailed discussion of the symbolic value of savage, peasant, and child to the romantic artist. It would be uncritical to exaggerate the importance of the noble savage. He is more popular in the earlier than in the later manifestations of Romanticism, and more popular with minor writers than with the really great men. Of these, none is at any time willing to adore him unreservedly, though several show admiration for one or more aspects of his character. But the noble savage is interesting in that he does, at curious times and in the hands of various writers, provide a vehicle for many romantic ideas. He can illustrate what a blessing it is to be ignorant of bewildering books, to what a low level man has deteriorated, to what a high level, since his native equipment is so promising, man may develop, the benign influence of scenery, the natural goodness of man and the badness of the civilization, which despite his natural goodness, he has somehow managed to create, the stupidity of building cities when the woods are so much better, the stupidity of making money when contentment depends upon not having any, the superiority of feeling to thinking, the possibility of finding God in nature, the benefits and pleasures of free and unsophisticated love, the fact that natural man is a natural poet, and other things of the same general kind. Although the virtues of the noble savage are more or less the same wherever he is found, those virtues are differently displayed by different races. The American Indian is the aristocrat of the group. His scorn of civilization, lively sense of gratitude, natural mysticism, dignity, oratorical ability, hospitality, and courage are all very impressive. His bloodthirstiness provides agreeable thrills, and it can always be explained in terms of resistance to European oppression or by glances at the vices of more refined nations. We might think him too stolid for romantic tastes, but he is supposed to be a true man of feeling beneath his stoical exterior. The South Sea Islander is a slighter, less imposing, more amiable figure. It goes into some discussion of how the South Sea Islander figures in romantic literature as well, particularly in Melville. Also in the romantic English poets of the 19th century. The African Negro joins the noble savage club rather late and is never so prominent a member as the Indian or the South Sea Islander.
Do the natives, the Indians, South American Indians, entrap the Americans?
South American Indians.
And the Mexicans?
I would say, oh yes, absolutely. I'm going to say in a moment, my suggestion is that we have to extend his list of figures upon whom the romantic image has been fastened. One may at least say that the noble savage and the noble peasant are similarly motivated. Both reflect a revulsion against what man has made of man. Both preach the gospel of nature worship, innocent simplicity, and anti-intellectualism. He's referring specifically to Wordsworth, some of Wordsworth's poetry, but This can be taken in a more general sense. Both the poor Indian and the poor peasant, then, may be used to exemplify the benefits of the natural religion. My point is not that the idealized peasant is an outgrowth of the noble savage, but that the two figures are harmoniously related in romantic thought. Of course, the idealized peasant has an independent line of development which reaches back even further than the ancestry of the noble savage. And on and on. Well, I think you see the essential point. Romantics, in their thrashings about to arrive at a freer state, feeling incredibly hemmed in by social circumstance, want to rise above, but more often than not are encouraged to dive deeper in and down as far as possible, hoping for some kind of revelation and release through the ultimate sensory experience. And in such violent movements, searchings, probings, an image is kept constantly in mind of the free, natural, wholesome man, the noble savage in one form or another. In all of the romantic searchings, there is the hope, one, to come upon the noble savage, to come close to him, to study him, to understand him, and finally to learn how to be like him. So that the transcendentalism might very well take the form of identification with and absorption into a totally alien way of life, if only you can dive far enough into it. And I think that to Fairchild's listing of certain examples of noble savage cultism, namely the savage, the peasant, and the child, we must add, in our times, the proletarian and the non-white, particularly certain kinds of non-whites, most particularly in our time, in this society, blacks. But please understand, I am not saying that this is a development that appeared overnight in this century. I'm suggesting that the romantic cultism that leads one to a fascination with the totally not I must have existed in the white mind in this country from the very beginning. And I think very possibly that is what you will have to draw upon if finally you want to explain a phenomenon that has happened here, and I don't believe has happened in any other caste society, namely the most enormous warping and searing ambivalence toward the human object labeled inferior, namely toward the slave. In very early colonial times, the Indian, but much later, because of the vast numbers in which he was present and because of his visibility everywhere, the slave. I suggest that very germane to our discussion is the incredible contrast between caste society in this country and traditional caste society in India. In India, the most rigorous set of caste distinctions was set up, the most careful and complicated set of caste lines were drawn, and it meant death to cross them. Once you define somebody as untouchable, you had better not touch him, on pain, literally, of death. And so I'm sure those of you who are anthropologists and sociologists know systems were set up that make the systems of separate facilities in our South traditionally look like the most incredible mingling of the races. There was to be no contact whatsoever between the Brahmins and other higher castes on the one hand and the untouchables on the other. It followed that on all levels of culture, the Indians were at least consistent, whatever moral judgment you may make of caste society. That is to say, if you once said that a group of people were untouchable socially and economically, you then went on to say they were untouchable as well sexually, culturally, and on in every dimension of cultural life you want to name.
Were were they allowed to be used economically? Were they allowed
Oh,
to
sure, they were the beasts of burden. Sure, they performed the role of slaves. They were the hewers of wood and drawers of water. Sure.
But even you, okay, I'm thinking
The
more
fact is, see, that there was a theological justification for this separation of human groups. It was said that the different castes developed from different parts of the body of Brahma. And the Hindu caste, the highest caste, was descended from Brahma's forehead. But the untouchables were descended from his lower parts. And so obviously it was destined by divine law that those who came from the lower quarters were simply beasts of burden. Those who came from the top were to be the thinkers as well as the rulers. It's clear that in our time there's been an enormous attempt, now for almost 300 years, to develop a theological justification for slavery. It never worked. It never worked. Did someone have a question?
Well, I was just going to say that there's a good example of romanticism concerning the untouchable in Ian Forster's passage to India during the trial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Good point. Well, maybe you see where the logic is leading. The thing that happened here, emotionally, that I don't believe has happened elsewhere in a caste society, is that the master caste was ridden from the beginning with an enormous amount of ambivalence. Once it was said that a group of human beings were inferior, and made inferior by God, the masters then were not able to take their eyes from those called inferior. They were fascinated. They asked of the black slaves many cultural products which they did not have themselves. An emblem of caste society in this country is that from earliest slave times on, performances of singing and dancing were given for bemused whites on a platform in Chatham Square in Lower Manhattan, on another platform in Congo Square in New Orleans, and on and on. It was, in a sense, the whites were begging for certain forms of cultural products from the people whom they had named untouchable. In other words, these people were not consistently defined as untouchable. They are untouchable economically, socially, and allegedly sexually, although we know that in fact that was not the case. They were not untouchable culturally. It was as though the whites felt an enormous lack of something in their lives, an enormous yearning, and turned to the untouchable to provide for it, even though that transcended definitions of untouchability. And I think without such ambivalence, you'll never, without acknowledging the existence of such ambivalence from the beginning, and ambivalence such as you've never seen elsewhere in a caste society, you cannot understand that the basic popular art forms, starting early in the 19th century and going right down through the 20th, have been derived very largely from the black world. I'm talking about the minstrel show in the 19th century, and I'm talking about basic music and dance, as well as certain forms of popular speech, vernacular, even certain forms of styles of dress and whatnot. There has been, in a situation where one group of people is defined as untouchable, there has been a constant touching culturally, even a fondling. And we know that that drive to embrace that which is not to be touched spilled over into the sex life of the country as well.
What's the significance
Of this,
of this?
I'm saying that in this country, there was, for many reasons that we can't go very deeply into, such an ambivalence, such a duality of values as to those defined as inferior, that once they were defined as inferior, we began indeed to say that in many senses they were superior. And I say that this is a unique expression of the unique kind of romanticism that has existed in the American mentality from the beginning. I'm saying that the search for the noble savage has been most dramatic and most violent in this country, and has led to a descendentalism, if you will, into those areas defined as beyond the pale, as subhuman. And I'm saying that this process, developing past the time when there was still a frontier where one could escape geographically, led finally to the establishing of bohemias in ghettos and slums throughout the country. And it was in these ghettos, in ghetto and slum bohemias, that proletarian literature first took shape, except it was amongst middle-class fugitives from orthodox society.
In order to perpetuate this romanticism and the idealizing of the noble salaries, they wanted to get closer to him, and
Absolutely.
that's why they went to the ghetto.
Absolutely.
So this
Right.
was just the romantic.
Exactly. Yes.
Carried out.
Exactly. Right. I would say that nowhere in the Western world has romanticism been so massively acted upon and acted out in daily life as in this country. And I think all of this is absolutely necessary background to for an understanding of how proletarian literature suddenly erupted here. It was the end product of a long history of bohemianism, which had in previous times attached romantic images to other groups of people, slaves, and then freed blacks, and then musicians, artists, performers, theatrical performers in various senses, along the way to American Indians, but that was a long time ago, occasionally to immigrant groups that retained some aspect of another lively culture. But I think that all of this searching for another and better kind of life, having exhausted other possibilities, finally turned itself to the proletariat. And of course, the proletariat has to be defined as being not just of a piece ethnically, but composed of many different kinds of people racially, including blacks, including immigrants of various sorts. But another thing has to happen before you get a full proletarian literature, namely, that rebelliousness in the sense of simply busting loose emotionally has to reach a point at which it says, yes, a better life is possible. I as a human being have the capacity for it, but the social structure surrounding me prevents me from fulfilling my potentials. And therefore, that social structure must be swept away before I and my fellow men can be liberated. At the moment that bohemian urgings and strivings reach that kind of thinking, it becomes politicalized. And that indeed, too, is what happened when the 30s were ushered in amongst writers and other kinds of artists. Let us establish just in passing that rebelliousness is nothing new amongst artists in this country. Now, before I get to that, I want to make a final point about bohemianism. I haven't established sufficiently that bohemianism took on a specific and unique quality in this country. Obviously, there have been areas that have been defined as bohemias elsewhere in Western Europe. The great bohemia of the entire world has always been, not Paris as a whole, but certain parts of Paris, particularly the left bank. But the left bank in Paris, traditionally, and this goes right back into the early 19th century, was absolutely cut off from the rest of society. The rest of the society went its orthodox way, and there was very little give and take between the two worlds. They were alien, the one to the other. Beyond that, not only was the Parisian bohemia cut off entirely, without any traffic between the two worlds, but by and large, people who gravitated there meant to stay. And many people lived their lives out as bohemians, never thought of altering, certainly not of improving their social positions. In both of these respects, the American bohemias have been departures from the norm. To begin with, they were located all over the country in all large urban centers. The Dill Pickle Club in Chicago, and its doings in various public parks there. Greenwich Village, of course, the Latin Quarter in New Orleans, certain areas of San Francisco. Some of you may know that at this very moment there exists a club in San Francisco called the Bohemian Club. But you are not familiar with its history. It is today a very elegant and very exclusive club. It's a mark of eliteness to belong to, but it was not that at the beginning. When it was founded and when it was first flourishing in the late 19th century, it was a community of artistic, liberated bums. It was a departure from society and not a mechanism to establish eliteness within the society. And many artists of the late 19th century had rich experiences and spent some years in that bohemia. Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, on and on. What distinguishes our bohemias is not simply the vast numbers in which they were established, but that one, their populations were transitory. A lot of people came, but a lot of people left, and it happened fast. In the Greenwich Village that I knew when I was living there in the 40s and 50s, I saw maybe 6 different waves of people come in and depart again. And remember, when they departed, they went back. They really went back. It's very much like the pattern you see today of teenage kids who run away from home. In this more affluent society, they're fortunate and they continue to often get regular checks from home. But at a given point, even the financial support collapses is not sufficient, and they go home in body, and I suppose to a large extent in spirit. In the traditional bohemias, very few people left and went back. For one thing, there wasn't much to go back to. For another, there was an absolute continuing revulsion with the alternative, so people stayed. And it was the typical situation of the artist living on the left bank of Paris, for example, that he never changed his conditions of life, even if he came upon money, even if he was lucky enough to get his paintings to sell before he died. It didn't happen very often. Usually these things sell long after the artist is buried. But it would make no difference. And if monies did come as a result of artwork, the monies were distributed to other people. Nobody thought about another kind of life if some degree of affluence came along. But here, almost from the very beginning, certainly through all of the 20th century, many people seem to have come to the various bohemias in a kind of time-serving sense, in almost a slumming spirit, with the idea that we're marking time for the moment, but we're going to make it, and when we do, we're going to move uptown, in New York terms. Many people have indeed made the passage from Greenwich Village to Park Avenue and on and on. That is one point that distinguishes our bohemias from all the others I know about. The other is that the clear line of demarcation between Bohemia and the Orthodox world is by no means hard and fast. This is a point that it's very hard to make abstractly. We simply don't have time to go into it in detail. But allow for the possibility, and perhaps think about this a bit, that in a very peculiar sense, in a sense not encountered anywhere else in the modern world, all of American society is somehow a bohemia, in a vague, diluted, around the edges sense. So that the absolute distinction between the way people live in a bohemia and the way they live outside of it is not that clear-cut. Anybody who's familiar with life amongst upper middle-class people in the center of Manhattan knows that very often they exhibit the same kinds of wildness, the same kinds of extremity, the same kinds of unbridled passions as traditionally only artists in a bohemia were supposed to. And sometimes even clashes have developed because of that. The two groups, the Greenwich Village group and the Midtown Swinging group, each insisting that its values are not to be shared and indeed cannot be shared, and if they're taken over by the other side, they are diluted and corrupted and distorted. There have been even some physical combats over all of this. Because the two worlds meet constantly, Greenwich Village artists love to go to Park Avenue parties. Park Avenue people love to go to Greenwich Village parties, you see. Well, I began to say that it is not a new phenomenon that writers began in the 1930s to attack their society. That actually, as again distinct from other countries of Western Europe, the tradition in American writing has been that of taking issue with the world as it is, with the American scene. It has been said that American literature is a history of 150 years of quarreling between the writer and his society. There are reasons for that. There's been no other society that I know about in which the artist has been so scorned. This has been changing in very recent years, but from early times on, well into the 20th century, the writer was considered to be somehow a deficient person because he chose not to engage in the truly manly pursuits. You can see why this would have happened, because this is the first society I know about that has been permeated with the mentality of action. American pragmatism, which again is the ideology of American capitalism, says that you judge a man by his works, how much he accomplishes in the world, what impact he has upon the outside world. And it's very hard to establish to the action-minded pragmatist that an artist has any impact whatsoever. And indeed, I'm prepared to acknowledge that he has very little impact. I would rather question whether impact is the standard by which you judge an artist's merit. But certainly, it is the standard by which an artist has been judged in this country. And so, the literary critic Van Wyck Brooks comes to say that the temper of this society as a whole is horribly evangelical. Pragmatists preach a lot, since the only test of a man's worth is how he alters the world about him. All kinds of people develop all kinds of ideas as to how to accomplish such changes and begin to preach them and shout them from the rooftops. Well, if the society as a whole is horribly evangelical, and I think you can find the most recent instance in Spiro Agnew, it's the evangelical type if ever there was one, and I think he means to have a certain impact on our immediate world too. If the society as a whole is shot through with such a mentality, writers are going to share it. They're going to share it particularly because they feel inferior, they feel left out of the main current, they feel looked down upon, and so they are going to try to prove that they are as concerned with the fate of the world as are sober, responsible citizens, and they are going to try to demonstrate that they have as many programs for altering that world, bettering it, as do other people. So many writers in this country, from earliest times on, have adopted this stance of secular priests, have sermonized, have held forth, have been hortatory, didactic, have produced a literature of exposure, which is a socially oriented literature. And I think you can say that literature from Uncle Tom's Cabin, certainly down through Huckleberry Finn, is of that order. That whether or not the artist truly had a lively social conscience, whether or not he truly had ideas, instrumental ideas for altering the world, he sure as hell was going to act as though he did. And often, the urge to establish that one was as tuned in with the world, could cope with it, and work to change it, as well as non-artistic citizens, led to a downgrading of purely literary values. In other words, it didn't matter so much how you said the thing as what you said. Content was more important than form. And so from the beginning amongst artists in this country, there has always been a tradition of anti-art and of anti-literature, as though literature by itself is a contemptible thing, because it is not action. But if you convey something that has the spirit of action, don't look too carefully at the way the words are used. That's not the important thing. Throughout our literature, there's been a tone of castigation, to find the villains, identify them, and hit out at them. But there's been such a fervor in this attack that one begins to wonder, in the sense that somebody in Shakespeare says, the lady doth protest too much. People who castigate too much are also suspect. And it turns out, indeed, in our literary history, that many of the people who started out as real firebrands, attacking everything in sight, exposing all the contemptible conditions with a note of righteous wrath, somewhere in mid-passage collapsed and rejoined the herd. So revolt has been both extreme in this country and of short duration. You think of the spirit that moved Mark Twain, for example, and his absolute hatred of the machine age and of capitalism, a man who you could say was a socialist almost in his genes. And you find him in his later years investing $300,000 in a new linotype machine, which he hoped would revolutionize the publishing business, and losing his shirt, by the way. Often when such people try to join a capitalist class, they find that they don't have the full qualifications needed. But that is a pattern worth keeping in mind, because we're going to see it most dramatically in the 1930s, namely that the stronger the literary rebel is, and the more he lashes out at the institutions about him, the more prone he is to collapse and crawl back to safety. I think that's probably a good point at which to end. And then you're all going to be astonished, but we're actually going to get to the 30s.